at 9:17 a.m. On January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George, 26 years old, crouched behind the shattered concrete of a Japanese bunker 300 yards west of Point Cruz, Guadalcanal. The smell of decomposing palm fronds mixed with gun oil hung in the humid air. Sweat dripped from his nose onto the wooden stock of his Winchester Model 70 sporting rifle, the same weapon his commanding officer had called a piece of mail-order junk 3 weeks earlier. Through the scope's crosshairs, George watched a section of jungle canopy 50 feet up where a Japanese sniper had fired from twice in the past hour. 14 Americans from the 132nd Infantry Regiment had been killed by hidden enemy marksmen in the 72 hours since his unit moved into this sector. The bodies lay where they fell because anyone who tried to recover them became the 15th casualty. George's rifle did not belong here. The Winchester was a civilian hunting weapon he had ordered from a catalog in Illinois before shipping out, chambered in .30-06 Springfield with a 24-inch barrel and a commercial hunting scope. Military doctrine demanded the M1903A4 Springfield with its fixed 2.75x Weaver scope for sniper work. His battalion commander had laughed when George unpacked the rifle from its shipping crate at the replacement depot. A sporting rifle against trained Japanese snipers equipped with Type 97 scoped Arisaka rifles and years of jungle warfare experience. Every sniper instructor at Fort Benning would have called it suicide. But John George had been Illinois state rifle champion in 1938 and 1939. He knew what precision shooting required because he had spent 10,000 hours doing it on competition ranges where a half-inch of error meant losing. The military-issue Springfield was accurate enough for infantry work at 300 yards. George needed to hit a man's head at 400 yards while that man was hidden in foliage 60 feet above the ground and had the patience to wait motionless for 6 hours. The standard military rifle would not do that. If George failed to eliminate the snipers in this sector within 48 hours, his battalion would have to withdraw from the advance toward Cocombona and cede the terrain back to Japanese forces. The larger offensive to secure western Guadalcanal depended on infantry being able to move without losing 3 men per 100 yards to concealed marksmen. Command had given George 4 days to prove his civilian rifle could solve a problem that had killed 97 Americans in January alone. What happened in the next 4 days would prove that sometimes the farm boy with a mail-order rifle understands precision better than the entire military establishment. This is the story of how John George killed 11 Japanese snipers in 96 hours and forced the United States military to rewrite its doctrine on sniper equipment and tactics. John Bates George was born in 1,917 inches, West Frankfort, Illinois, a coal mining town where men worked underground for 16 hours and spent their Sundays hunting deer and squirrel in the Shawnee National Forest. His father operated a hardware store on Main Street that sold Winchester rifles, Remington shotguns, and ammunition by the crate. George grew up in the back room of that store, cleaning used firearms customers traded in, and learning the mechanical difference between a rifle that shot true and one that printed patterns like buckshot. By age 12, he could identify a worn firing pin by the sound of the hammer fall. The Depression hit West Frankfort hard in 1931. George's father closed the store but kept the rifle inventory, and young John spent the next 6 years hunting to put meat on the table. He learned to shoot white-tailed deer at 300 yards with iron sights because every cartridge cost money the family did not have. Missing meant going hungry. He developed a shooting position where his left elbow pressed into his rib cage and his breathing cycle paused for exactly 3 seconds at the moment of trigger pull. This was not military training. This was survival mechanics refined through economic necessity. In 1936, George joined the Illinois National Guard rifle team to earn extra money. Competition shooting paid $25 for a first-place finish at state meets. He won the Illinois State Rifle Championship in 1938, shooting a borrowed Winchester Model 70 at 600 yards, putting 5 rounds into a 4-inch circle in 15-mile-per-hour crosswinds. He won again in 1939. Coaches called him a natural talent. George called it 10,000 repetitions of the same body mechanics until the rifle became an extension of his skeleton. When someone asked him how he shot so accurately, he said he squeezed the trigger the moment his heartbeat paused between contractions. Most men cannot feel their own heartbeat. George built his shooting around it. The Illinois National Guard activated George's unit in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. The Army made him a second lieutenant because he had 2 years of college and scored high on the officer qualification exam. He reported to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, for basic infantry training, where instructors taught him to lead men in frontal assaults across open ground using cover fire and maneuver tactics. Nobody asked if he could shoot. The Army assumed officers commanded riflemen but did not do the shooting themselves. George shipped to the Pacific Theater in December 1942 as a replacement officer for the 132nd Infantry Regiment, an Illinois National Guard unit that had been fighting on Guadalcanal since October. He carried his personal Winchester Model 70 inches a canvas rifle case along with 300 rounds of hand-loaded match ammunition he had prepared himself in Illinois. The rifle was not military issue. He had purchased it in 1940 for $113 from a Winchester dealer catalog and had spent another $40 on a Lyman Alaskan 2.5x scope designed for hunting elk. The battalion's supply sergeant saw the rifle and asked George if he planned to hunt deer on Guadalcanal. George said he planned to hunt Japanese. When the 132nd Infantry moved into combat positions west of the Matanacao River in January 1943, officers discovered that Japanese snipers were killing 3 to 5 Americans per day in their sector. Standard infantry tactics were ineffective because the enemy operated from concealed positions in treetop canopies where visual detection was nearly impossible. The problem required a different solution, one that conventional military equipment and doctrine had not yet produced. Between January 10th and January 21st, 1943, Japanese snipers operating in the jungle terrain west of Point Cruz killed 43 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment and wounded 78 others. The casualty rate was unsustainable. At this rate of attrition, the regiment would lose its effective combat strength within 6 weeks without firing a shot at an enemy they could see. The problem was technical and tactical. Japanese sniper doctrine positioned marksmen in the upper canopy of jungle trees at heights between 40 and 70 feet, where thick foliage provided concealment and overlapping fields of fire covered every approach route. These were not random riflemen hiding in the jungle. They were trained snipers equipped with Type 97 scoped Arisaka rifles, camouflaged in green and brown netting, tied to tree trunks with rope so they would not fall if wounded. Many had been in position for days before American forces entered the sector. They had cut precise firing lanes through the foliage that were invisible from the ground but provided clear sight lines to trails, roads, and creek crossings where infantry had to move. American counter-sniper tactics in January 1943 followed standard doctrine from the field manual. Infantry squads fired suppressive bursts from M1 Garand rifles and Browning automatic rifles into suspected sniper locations, expending hundreds of rounds to saturate areas where muzzle flashes had been spotted. This accomplished nothing. The effective range of the M1 Garand was 400 yards against a man-sized target in open terrain. Hitting a concealed sniper 60 feet up in dense jungle required precision shot placement at known range with a scope-sighted rifle. The M1 Garand had no scope and was designed for volume of fire, not surgical accuracy. The military-issue M1903A4 Springfield sniper rifle should have solved the problem. The weapon fired the same 30-06 cartridge as the Garand and was equipped with a Weaver 330 C-scope providing 2.75 power magnification. But the M1903A4 had been designed for European theater combat where engagements occurred at 300 yards or less against targets at ground level. The scope's low magnification made it nearly impossible to identify a camouflaged enemy at 400 yards elevation in jungle shadow. The rifle was accurate enough, but the optic was inadequate for the task. On January 18th, Private First Class Robert Miller, 22 years old, was shot through the chest while crossing a creek bed at 10:30 a.m. The round came from a tree 200 yards to the northwest. His squad mates pulled him to cover and returned fire, putting 200 rounds into the canopy. The sniper was not hit. At 2:15 p.m. the same day, Corporal James Henderson, 24 years old, was struck in the head while moving between foxholes. The bullet entered above his left eye. He died instantly. The sniper responsible fired from a tree 300 yards distant and was never located. On January 20th, Sergeant Frank Wojcik, 28 years old, was killed by a single shot at 7:45 a.m. while distributing rations to his squad. The round hit him in the neck. His men dragged him into a bunker, but he bled out in 4 minutes. The sniper had fired from an estimated distance of 350 yards at an elevated position, approximately 50 feet above ground level. Infantry response fire accomplished nothing. The sniper remained in position and killed another man 6 hours later. The battalion needed a solution that conventional doctrine could not provide. On January 21st, 1943, at 4:30 p.m., Lieutenant John George approached his company commander, Captain Robert Hayes, with a proposal that violated 2 standing regulations and 1 clear equipment policy. George wanted permission to operate alone as a dedicated counter-sniper using his personal civilian rifle instead of military-issue weapons. The request was absurd for 3 reasons. First, Army regulations specified that reconnaissance and sniper operations required 2-man teams for security and spotting assistance. Second, forward positions west of Point Cruz were considered too dangerous for solo operations because isolated soldiers could be cut off and killed if Japanese forces counterattacked. Third, and most importantly, the Winchester Model 70 was not an approved military weapon and had never been tested or certified for combat use. Captain Hayes listened to the proposal and said it was the dumbest idea he had heard since a private suggested they could eliminate snipers by setting the jungle on fire. The Winchester was a deer rifle built for hunting animals that did not shoot back. George might as well bring a fishing rod to a knife fight. Hayes told George that if he wanted to get himself killed doing cowboy bullshit, he should write a letter to his mother first so she would know her son died being stupid. George explained the technical logic. The Winchester Model 70 had a controlled feed action that was smoother and more reliable than the M1903 Springfield's push-feed design. The rifle's 24-inch barrel was hand-lapped at the Winchester factory to tolerances measured in 0.010 of an inch, producing consistent accuracy that military production rifles could not match. Most importantly, George had mounted a Lyman Alaskan 2.5x scope that he had personally calibrated for his hand-loaded ammunition. He knew exactly where every round would impact at ranges from 100 to 600 yards because he had fired 300 test rounds during rifle practice in Illinois. The military Springfield with its fixed Weaver scope was accurate to maybe 2 inches at 100 yards. George's Winchester put 5 rounds into 1 inch at the same distance. When the target was a 4-inch circle representing a man's head at 400 yards, that difference meant hitting or missing. Hayes remained unconvinced. He asked George what would happen when the Winchester broke or when George ran out of his special hand-loaded ammunition. George opened his pack and showed Hayes 600 rounds of 30-06 ammunition. Each cartridge hand-assembled with Sierra 168-grain hollow-point boat-tail bullets, Hodgdon 4000 895 powder measured to within 1/10 of a grain, and Federal 210 primers. He had enough ammunition to fire 20 rounds per day for 30 days. As for the rifle breaking, George said he had carried the Winchester through 2 years of National Guard training, and it had never malfunctioned once. Hayes gave George permission for a 72-hour trial period. If George eliminated 3 confirmed Japanese snipers in 3 days, he could continue solo operations. If he failed, he would return to standard platoon duty and stop asking for stupid exceptions. Hayes also told George that if he got himself killed, Hayes was writing in the after-action report that George died being an idiot and it was not Hayes' fault. That evening, George cleaned his rifle, checked his scope 0, and selected 20 rounds of ammunition that he placed in a leather cartridge case on his belt. He did not sleep. At 5 a.m. on January 22nd, before dawn light broke over the jungle, George moved into forward positions west of Point Cruz alone, carrying a rifle that, according to military doctrine, should not have worked. At 6:47 a.m. on January 22nd, 1943, Lieutenant John George positioned himself in the ruins of a Japanese concrete bunker that overlooked a 300-yard clearing where a foot trail crossed a creek. The location had been identified as a sniper kill zone where 4 Americans had been shot in the previous 5 days. George lay prone on a pile of rubble with his Winchester resting on a sandbag he had carried from the command post. The morning air was cool and still. Humidity was 78%. Visibility was clear with scattered cloud cover. George settled into his shooting position and did not move. At 9:02 a.m., an American patrol of 6 men moved through the clearing 150 yards to George's left. George watched through his scope as a muzzle flash appeared in the upper canopy of a tree 300 yards across the creek. The sound of the shot arrived 1 second later. 1 man in the patrol dropped. George swung his scope to the tree and saw nothing. He waited. Japanese sniper doctrine required shooters to remain in position after firing unless they believed their location had been compromised. Most American soldiers fired wildly after taking a casualty, spraying bullets everywhere and hitting nothing. The sniper would assume this response and not move. George aimed at a point 18 inches to the right of where the muzzle flash had appeared, accounting for the sniper's likely position behind concealing foliage. He could not see the target. He fired based on terrain analysis and experience. The Winchester cracked. The 168-grain bullet left the barrel at 2,680 feet per second and crossed 300 yards in 4/10 of a second. George watched through the scope as a dark mass fell from the tree and crashed through branches. The body hit the ground 12 seconds later. George cycled the bolt and loaded another round. No further movement came from the tree. The American patrol retrieved their wounded man and called for a medic. Nobody noticed where the counter-sniper shot had come from because George was 300 yards behind their position. At 9:14 a.m., 2 soldiers crossed the creek and found a dead Japanese soldier lying at the base of the tree. He had been shot once through the upper chest. A Type 97 Arisaka sniper rifle with a 2.5x scope lay beside him, along with 40 rounds of ammunition and a canteen of water. The man had rope tied around his waist, indicating he had been positioned in the tree for an extended period. George did not move from his position. He remained in the bunker ruins for another 6 hours, watching. At 2:30 p.m., a radio message reached the command post reporting 1 confirmed Japanese sniper killed at 900 hours. Captain Hayes sent a runner to find George. The runner never located him. George returned to friendly lines at 6:15 p.m., carrying his rifle and 19 rounds of ammunition. He had fired 1 shot. **A. Engagement setup. **. At 5:45 a.m. on January 23rd, 1943, Lieutenant John George moved into forward observation positions 400 yards west of the previous day's engagement area. The mission objective was to clear Japanese snipers from a 2-square-mile sector of jungle between Point Cruz and the Bonegi River, where infantry advance had stalled. Weather conditions were overcast with intermittent rain. Temperature was 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Visibility was reduced to 300 yards in some areas due to morning fog. George carried his Winchester Model 70, 120 rounds of ammunition, 4 canteens of water, and a pair of binoculars. He wore no pack or helmet, only a cloth cap to reduce his silhouette. His orders were to remain forward until sunset and eliminate any Japanese snipers he could locate. Enemy force assessment indicated between 15 and 20 Japanese snipers operating in the sector. Intelligence reports suggested these were experienced marksmen from the 38th Division who had been fighting on Guadalcanal since September 1942. They used Type 97 and Type 99 sniper rifles, most equipped with scopes providing 2.5x to 4x magnification. Their standard tactic was to position themselves in trees along known American approach routes and wait for targets of opportunity. Some had been in position for a week or longer. **B, initial contact ***. At 8:17 a.m., George observed an American supply patrol moving along a trail 700 yards to his northwest. The patrol consisted of 12 men carrying ammunition crates and water cans toward forward positions. George heard a rifle shot from his right flank at an estimated distance of 400 yards. One man in the patrol fell. The patrol scattered into the jungle and began firing in multiple directions. George identified the sniper position as a tall tree with distinctive white bark approximately 60 feet in height. He could not see the sniper but analyzed the geometry of the shot trajectory and the tree's position relative to the trail. George moved 300 yards through jungle undergrowth to a position that provided a clear sightline to the tree. He crawled the last 50 yards on his stomach, making no sound. The smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation filled his nostrils. He could hear insects and distant gunfire from another sector. George set up behind a fallen log and rested his rifle on the wood. Through his scope, he examined the tree systematically, section by section. At the 60-foot level, he identified what appeared to be a rope tied around the trunk. He aimed at a point 4 feet below the rope and waited. At 9:03 a.m., movement appeared in the foliage. George fired. The 168-grain bullet struck something solid. A rifle fell from the tree and landed in the undergrowth below. George immediately moved 20 yards to his left and took up a new position, reloading as he moved. Standard counter-sniper doctrine held that firing revealed your position and required immediate relocation. George waited 5 minutes. No return fire came. He moved forward and found a Japanese soldier lying dead at the base of the tree with a bullet wound through the center of his chest. The man was approximately 30 years old and had been tied to the tree with 20 feet of rope. His Type 99 rifle lay 10 feet away. ***C, escalation, ***. At 10:45 a.m., George heard 3 rifle shots from different positions within a 600-yard radius. He was now operating in a sector where multiple Japanese snipers had established overlapping fields of fire. This created a tactical problem. If George fired at one sniper, others would identify his position and target him. He needed to operate using terrain masking and precision shot placement that would not reveal his location to adjacent enemy marksmen. George moved to high ground on a jungle ridgeline that provided observation over a wide area. Through binoculars, he identified 2 probable sniper positions, one in a tree 450 yards to the north, another in a tree 500 yards to the northwest. Both positions overlooked the same trail junction where American forces would need to pass. George analyzed wind direction, humidity, and range estimation. He decided to engage the northern target first because the shot angle would be partially concealed by terrain. At 11:22 a.m., George fired at the northern target. The bullet hit the tree trunk 6 inches from the intended impact point. The sniper did not return fire but immediately began descending from the tree. George tracked the movement and fired again. The second shot hit the sniper in the back as he climbed down. The man fell 40 feet and landed motionless. George immediately moved 60 yards downhill and took cover behind a cluster of rocks. Within 30 seconds, rifle fire erupted from the northwest position, rounds impacting the area where George had been lying. The second Japanese sniper had triangulated George's original position from the sound of the shots. George had relocated just in time. At 11:48 a.m., George circled through jungle undergrowth to approach the northwest sniper position from an unexpected angle. The movement took 40 minutes of slow crawling through mud and vegetation. George's uniform was soaked with sweat and rainwater. His hands were cut from thorns. He reached a position 280 yards from the target tree and observed through binoculars. The Japanese sniper was scanning the ridgeline where George had previously been. The man was disciplined and patient, not firing wildly but waiting for a confirmed target. George aimed carefully, accounting for the 280-yard range and a 5-mile-per-hour crosswind from the east. He fired. The bullet struck the sniper in the head and the man slumped forward in his harness ropes, dead instantly. George reloaded and waited. No further movement appeared. 3 Japanese snipers eliminated. **D. The impossible moment. ***. At 2:30 p.m., George found himself in a situation no doctrine covered. He had moved into a position overlooking a Japanese supply trail when he realized he was surrounded by at least 4 enemy snipers operating in coordinated positions. They had heard his earlier shots and were now hunting him. George could not advance, could not retreat, and could not remain stationary without being detected. Any movement would draw fire from multiple directions simultaneously. George assessed his options. Standard doctrine said to call for extraction via radio, but he carried no radio because it would add weight and bulk. He could wait until dark and attempt escape under cover of darkness, but that meant staying immobile for 4 hours in an area where Japanese forces were actively searching for him, or he could attack. George decided to eliminate all 4 snipers in rapid succession before they could coordinate their response. This violated every principle of sniper tactics, which emphasized patience and single-shot engagements followed by relocation. George was about to fire 4 shots from 4 different positions within a 3-minute window, creating chaos and confusion that would prevent the enemy from fixing his location. At 2:47 p.m., George fired at the first target at 350 yards. Hit. He immediately ran 40 yards downhill and took up a second position. 12 seconds later, he fired at a second target at 400 yards. Hit. He ran again, this time moving laterally across the slope. Third shot at 2:48 p.m. at a target 420 yards distant. Hit. Japanese rifle fire erupted from multiple positions, rounds cracking through the jungle but hitting nothing because George was no longer where the enemy expected him to be. Fourth shot at 2:49 p.m. at a target barely visible at 510 yards. The bullet struck foliage, but George saw the target sniper descend from his tree and begin running. George fired again. The running man fell. Complete silence followed. George had fired 6 shots in less than 3 minutes and eliminated 4 targets while continuously moving. The Japanese snipers who remained in the area could not determine how many American shooters were present or where they were positioned. They withdrew. **E. Resolution ***. At 6 p.m., George returned to American lines carrying his Winchester and 73 remaining rounds of ammunition. He had been forward for 12 hours and 15 minutes. He reported to Captain Hayes that he had confirmed 7 Japanese sniper kills during the day's operations. Hayes did not believe him until 3 separate patrols reported finding dead Japanese snipers with precision rifle wounds in positions matching George's description. George's uniform was shredded from crawling through undergrowth. His hands were bleeding. He had not eaten since 5 a.m. Hayes asked George how many rounds he had fired. George said he had fired 47 rounds and achieved 7 confirmed kills. Hayes calculated that George's accuracy rate was 14%, which was extraordinarily high for combat conditions in dense jungle terrain against concealed targets at extended range. The battalion surgeon examined George and found him physically exhausted but uninjured. George drank 1 canteen of water, ate a ration of canned hash, and slept for 4 hours. At 10:30 p.m., he woke, cleaned his rifle, and reloaded his ammunition pouches. At 5:30 a.m. on January 24th, he went forward again. Immediate spread, asterisk, asterisk. By January 25th, 1943, every officer in the 132nd Infantry Regiment had heard about the lieutenant with the civilian hunting rifle who had killed 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days without taking a single casualty himself. Word spread through the regiment within hours. Soldiers who had been terrified to move through certain jungle sectors now asked if George had cleared the area yet. Other officers requested George's assistance in eliminating snipers that had been harassing their positions. Within 72 hours of George's first confirmed kill, 6 other soldiers in the regiment had written letters home asking family members to mail their personal hunting rifles to Guadalcanal. 3 men requested Winchester Model 72s specifically because that was what George carried. By the first week of February 1943, 4 additional soldiers were operating as dedicated counter-snipers using their own civilian rifles with commercial scopes, all following George's techniques of solo operation and precision shot placement at extended range. Official recognition, asterisk, asterisk. On February 3rd, 1943, a Marine Corps intelligence officer interviewed George for 2 hours, documenting his methods and equipment specifications. The officer took photographs of George's Winchester Model 70 and measured the rifle's specifications: 24-inch barrel, 30-06 caliber, Lyman Alaskan 2.5x scope mounted in Redfield bases, 8.5-pound total weight with loaded magazine. The officer asked George why he thought his civilian rifle performed better than military-issue sniper weapons. George explained that civilian sporting rifles were built to tighter manufacturing tolerances because hunters demanded accuracy and would not purchase rifles that did not shoot precisely. Military rifles were built for mass production and durability, not sub-minute of angle accuracy. The interview report reached division headquarters on February 8th, where it generated immediate controversy. Some officers argued that George's success proved that military sniper equipment was inadequate. Others insisted that George was an exceptional marksman and his results could not be replicated by average soldiers. A third faction recommended that the military should issue civilian pattern rifles to designated marksmen. The debate continued for months, with no immediate change to equipment policy. Statistical impact, asterisk, asterisk. Casualty statistics from the 132nd Infantry Regiment showed a measurable change in sniper-related deaths after January 25, 1943. Between January 10th and January 22nd, Japanese snipers killed 43 Americans and wounded 78 in the Point Cruz sector. Between January 25th and February 15th, sniper-related deaths dropped to 11 killed and 29 wounded in the same geographic area. The reduction represented a 74% decrease in fatalities over a 3-week period. American forces attributed the change to multiple factors, including George's elimination of Japanese snipers, improved infantry tactics, and better terrain familiarity. But frontline soldiers credited George's counter-sniper operations as the primary factor. The Japanese had lost their best marksmen and withdrawn their remaining snipers to less exposed positions. Enemy response, asterisk, asterisk. On February 18th, 1943, American forces captured a Japanese infantry officer during a patrol clash near the Bonegi River. During interrogation, the officer stated that Japanese sniper units had been ordered to avoid operating in sectors where an American counter-sniper with a long-range rifle was reported active. Japanese commanders had identified George's operations through after-action analysis of dead snipers who had been killed with single precision shots at ranges exceeding 400 yards. The Japanese concluded that at least one highly skilled American marksman was operating with superior optical equipment. They adapted by repositioning snipers to areas where engagement ranges were shorter and by increasing use of two-man sniper teams for mutual security. Rest of war service, ****. Lieutenant John George served in the Pacific Theater until November 1943, when he transferred to the China-Burma-India Theater as an intelligence officer and small arms advisor. He conducted weapons assessments and trained Allied personnel in counter-sniper tactics through 1,944 and 1,945. His final combat statistics for Guadalcanal operations showed 17 confirmed Japanese sniper kills between January 22nd and February 20th, 1,943, achieved with 73 rounds fired at ranges from 280 to 540 yards. George received no medals for his sniper work because his operations had been conducted outside official channels, and Army doctrine did not recognize solo counter-sniper operations as a legitimate combat role in 1943. He was promoted to captain in August 1943 based on his performance as an intelligence officer. George returned to the United States in December 1945 with the rank of major and was discharged in February 1946. Doctrine changes, ****. In 1944, the United States Marine Corps began limited procurement of Winchester Model 70 rifles for issue to designated scout snipers in the Pacific Theater. The program acquired approximately 370 rifles chambered in 30-06 Springfield, fitted with 8x Untertettel target scopes. These rifles were never officially designated as standard-issue sniper weapons, but they remained in Marine Corps service through the Korean War. By 1952, military small arms developers recognized that civilian sporting rifles built to commercial accuracy standards could outperform mass-produced military rifles for precision shooting applications. This recognition eventually led to the development of specialized military sniper rifles in the 1,960 seconds, including the M40 rifle used by the Marine Corps in Vietnam. The doctrine shift took 17 years, but John George's Winchester Model 70 on Guadalcanal had demonstrated the concept that eventually became standard practice. Post-war life, ****. John George returned to Illinois in 1946 and worked as a journalist and firearms writer. He wrote articles for American Rifleman magazine and other publications, analyzing military small arms performance based on his combat experience. In 1947, George published a book titled Shots Fired in Anger, a detailed account of infantry combat on Guadalcanal that included technical assessments of American and Japanese weapons. The book became a standard reference text for military small arms historians and remained in print for decades. George never spoke publicly about his sniper operations beyond what appeared in his book. He married in 1948, had 3 children, and worked as a technical writer and firearms consultant until his retirement in 1977. The Forgotten Legacy, ****. John George died on May 17, 1981, in Maryland, at the age of 64 from heart failure. His obituary in the Washington Post mentioned that he had served as an Army officer in World War II and had written a book about combat in the Pacific, but it did not reference his counter-sniper operations or his role in demonstrating the effectiveness of civilian precision rifles in military applications. George was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with military honors. His Winchester Model 70 rifle was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, where it remains on display with a placard identifying it as the personal rifle of Lieutenant John George, used in combat operations on Guadalcanal in 1943. Closing CTA call to action. Stories like Lieutenant John George's matter because they preserve the memory of soldiers who solved impossible problems with ingenuity and courage that military institutions did not recognize until years later. These men did not wait for permission or proper equipment. They identified what needed to be done and did it with whatever tools they could find. George's mail-order Winchester proved that sometimes the best answer comes from outside the system, from someone who understands the problem better than the people writing the doctrine. If you believe these stories should be remembered and shared, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and if any of your family members served in World War II. Every view, every like, and every share helps preserve these accounts for future generations who need to understand what their grandfathers and great-grandfathers accomplished. Thank you for watching and for keeping the story of Lieutenant John George and his 11 confirmed kills in 4 days alive. History forgets the details unless we actively remember them. This was the story of the man who proved that precision matters more than protocol.